Welcome back, Highlanders, to part 2 of Chapter 7, where we're going to talk about timber stands and forest management as we continue our discussion on renewable resources. All right, so in this particular section, we're going to be focusing on when to cut down trees and how to manage your own timber stand should you end up, say, buying some property. Maybe not here in Riverside, but if you move out to like the Pacific Northwest or maybe closer along the East Coast, right, you're going to have access to a lot of trees, or maybe even Northern California, you might have access to a lot of trees on your property. You might want to sell your timber at some point to a logging company, keep that money, and then hopefully manage your forest in such a way that you can make even more money in the future. So with that in mind, let's talk about how to do that. So should we let a tree continue to grow, or should we harvest it and sell it now? Well, the answer to that question is going to depend on a couple of things, right? The benefits of letting a tree grow is that as long as it's still growing, it's going to get bigger, and the bigger the tree, the more wood you have to sell, right? So the more profit you're going to get from cutting down that tree and selling it, right? Now, the cost of letting the tree grow is the opportunity cost of the foregone tree revenue now. So if you cut down the tree now and you sell it, you can not only use that money or spend it, but you can also invest it and earn a rate of return on that money, right? But if you let that tree grow for another year, right, then you're not only losing out on having the money for that tree now, but you're losing out on all the interest or rate of return that that money could be made if you have invested it in the stock market or put it in some kind of savings account. Right, so the cost of letting the tree grow includes the lost value of having the money now and what that money could have earned if you had invested it instead. Right, so should we cut down the tree? Well, it depends on the tree's growth rate and the current market interest rate. So with that in mind, here's a question for you. Imagine that a tree can sell for $500 today and has a growth rate, which is going to abbreviate as G, of 7% per year. Now, the current market rate, or we're going to abbreviate that as a lowercase r there, is 5%. So should we cut down the tree now, or should we let it grow for a year and cut it down 1 year from now? Right, so if you cut down the tree today and you invest the money, here's what you'd see. So I'm going to exit the full screen mode here so we can use some different colors. But if that tree is worth $500 a day and you cut it down, then you're going to get that full $500, and you're going to be able to invest that. And that's at a rate of 1 plus R, or that market interest rate. So this is going to be $500 times, sorry, not plus, but times 1 plus, and we declared that interest rate to be 0.05, right? So now you're looking at $500 times 1.05, and so that's going to be equal to $525 that you would have 1 year from now if you cut down that tree now and invested that money. Now, what happens if you were to say let that tree grow for a year and then cut it down later? Well, if you cut down the tree 1 year from now, again, the tree would be worth $500 today, but 1 year from now, it's going to be a little bit bigger. So you multiply that by 1 plus G, or that growth rate. So in the problem that we just talked about, that growth rate of that tree was growing at about 7% per year. So that's 1 plus 0.07. So it's going to be $500 times 1.07, which is going to be equal to $535 1 year from now. So in this particular instance, you would actually make more money in 1 year's time if you let that tree grow. So you don't particularly need the money right away, then it might make sense to go ahead and let that tree grow, right? So the moral of the story here is if the growth rate is higher than the interest rate, or G is greater than R, and this part's important, and the tree is still growing, hasn't reached its maximum height yet, then it might be better to wait and cut it down later. But if your growth rate is less than the interest rate, or the interest rate is higher than the growth rate, or if you desperately need the money, maybe you made some bad bets, you have somebody from the mafia or some bookie coming to get you, whatever the reason, you need the money now, or again, if the interest rate is higher than the growth rate, it's better to cut the tree down now. So again, you want to look at the growth rate of the tree relative to the interest rate to make that decision about whether to cut it down or let it grow. Is kind of the idea. All right. So with that in mind, somebody who's going to help you make these kinds of decisions is what's called a force manager. And so in order to understand kind of how to make decisions in terms of best using your force, we're going to talk about the different kinds of cuts that are available that you can have done to your property or to your timber stand. In order to understand that, I'm going to show you a quick video here. So I used to teach a class back at West Virginia University called Economics Education and the Environment, and is basically it's taking a bunch of high school teachers through the woods and talking to them about how a tree goes from becoming a tree into becoming things like pencils and paper and wood flooring. And so we go through that whole process with them, and we talk about the different kinds of timber stands and cuts and things like that, right, as part of that class. So what we're going to do here is we're going to watch somebody operating a feller buncher, which is kind of a nifty device that they use to cut down and strip trees so they can send these trees through the sawmill. I want you to listen to Professor of Forestry Joe McNeil talk a little bit about what this person is doing, right? In particular, the beginning part where he talks about cutting off the end of this particular log because it's bent. And a bent log doesn't have as much value because you can't really get it through the sawmill and cut up into the different pieces of wood that you might need to use or sell to, say, Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever. Right, so again, listen to Joe McNeil talk a little bit about that, and then also, of course, just marvel at the ability of the person operating this machine to cut down these trees. Let's take a look.
They'll flip that end because it has no value. The bent end. Can't get that through the sawmill.
It's about 2:30.
Are you enjoying this? Yeah. You got to go to the mill pretty soon. It's going to take me how long? 25 minutes? 25 minutes to get there? You know how to get there from right out of...
And I believe that's where the video cuts out. Right, so he talks about going to the mill after there. So one thing that the mill has that's pretty interesting is what's called a wood optimizer. And basically it's a computer that downloads the prices of different pieces of wood from all over the country or even the world. And as a log goes through the machine will automatically cut that log up into the pieces that are that would get the most profit out of that log, right? Based on those real-time prices that are constantly being downloaded. Right, so as you can see, it's a pretty efficient process when you have this kind of machinery available. That piece of machinery is called a feller buncher, and somebody who's using that machine can do about 7 times the work of people who are operating chainsaws. Right, and again, you can see it takes some skill to be able to use that machine. Once you got it down, you can get a lot done pretty quickly. Right, and again, at the beginning of that video, he's talking about flipping the end of that log, or basically cutting off that bent end because it's not going to be able to make it through the sawmill in an efficient way. Right, so let's go ahead and you keep on rocking here and talk a little bit about this idea of forest management. Right, so you can see if you want one of those feller bunchers on your property, cutting down your trees. All right, so there are different ways that you can cut your timber stands that will affect both the value of the harvest that you're taking out now, as well as the future value of your land. And we're going to talk about several different types of cuts here in this particular class, and make sure you understand the difference between them, right? So one type of cut is called a clear cut, and that's what you see here in this first picture. So that's kind of an example of a clear cut, right? It's basically cutting down all the trees in a particular area. Right, now the other type of cut that we're going to be talking about is called a shelter wood cut, which is kind of represented in this picture here. And that involves leaving some trees to provide shade for more shade tolerant species of tree. And so you're going to cut down like patches of trees into a certain area, right, over a long period of time, but you're not going to clear cut or take out all the trees in a particular area. And then the other type of cut that we're going to talk about is known as high grading, or sometimes it's called diameter select limit cutting, right? And that is just cutting down the best trees and only leaving those undesirable trees. So those that are bent or warped, those are the only trees that you're going to leave standing, right? So those are 3 types of cuts that we're going to be talking about in this particular class. And again, you can decide what type of cut is best for your property after listening to this lecture, right? But here's something I want you to note. Please don't hate loggers for being loggers. Cutting down trees does not necessarily harm the environment. In some cases, cutting down some or all the trees might be the best way to replenish the environment. So I know that when I ever say the word clear cut, a lot of people who consider themselves environmentalists get very upset at the prospect of clear cutting trees, right, or getting rid of a bunch of trees in a particular area. But do understand that clear cutting isn't necessarily all bad. It kind of depends on the circumstance in which these trees are being cut. So with that in mind, let's go over some kind of myths and truths about clear cutting before, again, you start judging those loggers, or anybody who chooses to have their land clear cut for that matter, right? So clear cutting, good or bad? Well, again, it depends on what type of tree you have, right? But for starters here, let's talk about some myths of clear cutting and whether or not these myths hold up. So one myth is that clear cutting is about harvesting trees at the expense of the environment. And the reason why that's a myth is because if you were to ask any logger, right, they wouldn't prefer a clear cut if they could help it, because clear cut means taking down all the trees, including those that are less valuable, right? The truth is that the principal objective of clear cutting is usually to regenerate the forest with healthier trees, not necessarily to harvest timber. If the objective was to harvest timber, then the loggers would be doing what's called that high grading or diameter select limit cutting, where they cut down the best trees, the ones that are the most profitable, and then they leave all the warped trees around, right? What clear cutting does is it forces the logger to cut down all the trees, not just the profitable ones, but the ones that don't make as much money. And again, the reason why you might want to do that is because it's going to help the environment regenerate or replenish. So clear cutting is especially useful for regenerating species of trees that are what we call shade intolerant, or trees that prefer a lot of sunlight, right? So again, there are some trees out there that need sunlight to grow, and the best way to regenerate a forest is to clear cut it so that there's plenty of sunlight to allow the new species of trees to grow in the wake of those trees that were removed, right? So again, the way that clear cutting works is it kind of mimics the opening of forests in the same way that nature does it, through either tornadoes or fires or things like that, right? And in such a way helps replenish that environment. So another myth about clear cutting is that clear cutting causes soil erosion. And the reason why that's a myth is because clear cutting does not cause soil erosion if you do it correctly, right? So it's not clear cutting that causes the soil erosion, but it's poorly laid out road systems created by loggers that creates that problem, right? So clear cutting and soil erosion can be linked in that they happen at the same time, but association isn't necessarily causation. It's not the clear cutting that causes the soil erosion, but again, a road system created by loggers if they don't follow what is known as the BMP, or best management practices. So clear cutting can be done without causing any significant soil erosion if the roads are built using, again, these best management practices that are designed to protect streams and the environment, right? So again, there are correct and incorrect ways to clear cut. If you clear cut correctly, then you shouldn't have this soil erosion, right? That only happens when the clear cutting is done not using these best management practices, or basically when loggers are trying to cut corners or just being lazy. Another myth is that logging companies prefer clear cutting because it's the most economical way to harvest timber. And as mentioned with the first myth, that's not necessarily the case, right? Remember, clear cutting is more about regenerating the forest over a long period of time. If loggers really just cared about the most economical way to harvest timber, then again they practice that high grading and just cut down the most profitable trees. So many logging companies dislike clear cutting because it forces them to spend the time and money cutting down trees that they have no use for, including bent or warped trees like the ones you see in this picture here, right? So again, if it were up to the logger, they probably wouldn't engage in clear cutting unless you told them to. They'd probably do that high grading and just take out those most profitable trees. Now, something that is not a myth but is actually true is that clear cutting can be unsightly in that it does remove all the trees and leaves a big patch or empty piece in your forest stand, right? So diameter limit cutting or select cutting, known as high grading, again, just cutting down those profitable trees or those over a selected diameter, is considered a little less unsightly in that it does leave some trees standing, and so it doesn't look like your forest is completely barren. Right, so on the left you see a clear cut, and on the right you see some diameter limit cutting there, right? And as you can see, diameter limit cutting does leave a lot of trees and can look better in terms of you still looking like you have woods on your property. But again, this can degrade the long-term health of the forest, and that it doesn't open up that area as much to allow the new species of trees and bushes and things like that to grow, right? So again, while clear cutting looks more unsightly now, it might lead to a healthier forest in the future. Whereas while diameter limit cutting makes you more money now and looks a little less unsightly, it can degrade the long-term health of your forest, and that your future tree growth won't be nearly as plentiful as it would be if you practiced that clear cutting. All right, now another myth is that clear cutting will destroy an animal's natural habitat or reduce the amount of species in that area. Right. With that in mind, again, that is largely a myth. In truth, clear cutting can be very beneficial to wildlife by increasing the biological diversity of the forest. Right. So after clear cutting, there's a lot of new openings that grow very quickly into small trees and berry and seed producing shrubs, which provide a lot of food and shelter for the wildlife in that area. Clear cutting is known for increasing the biological diversity of the forest by enhancing the habitat for the variety of wildlife, much of which is going to thrive better in these kind of bushy thickets and small saplings that tend to grow better in these clear-cut areas. So what we have here are some graphs that show you kind of how these species have replenished after different kinds of cut. So the first species we're going to talk about is a species of bird called the common yellowthroat. That's the one up here at the top, right? If you're looking at that bird, right, if you look at the birds per plot here in terms of their years after harvest, right? This black line is representing what we just call the clear cut, right? So notice that with the clear cut, you have a much bigger number of, or much larger number of birds per plot, right? Even initially in these years after harvest, or especially initially in these years after harvest, right? Compared to other things like that shelter wood cutting, or if you just leave the area unharvested, or if you just cut down a single tree, a single type of tree, or a group of several different types of trees, right? You can see clear cutting provides a lot more benefit to that particular type of bird and than compared to these other types of cuts. Now, this is also true with the prairie warbler, which is this bird here, right? The one at the bottom, right? Again, the clear cut you can see is going to result in a lot more birds per plot over time than other types of cuts. Right, and that's true for just about a variety of species out there. Right, again, clear cut is going to open up that area for those berry and seed producing shrubs and bushes and saplings that are going to provide a nicer home for these types of species. Right, so it's not true that clear cutting destroys the animal's natural habitat. If anything, it could actually be beneficial to that natural habitat. Again, if you engage in things like that high grading where you just cut down the most profitable trees, well, that's something that is going to be less likely to increase the biological diversity of your forest. Right. So while clear cutting is not always the best way to regenerate a forest, it can be the best in certain situations. It really depends on what kind of timber stand you have or what kind of trees that you're growing on your piece of property. Now, there's this other type of cutting that we mentioned before called shelter wood cutting, and this revolves around cutting down and removing mature trees, some mature trees, but leaving some behind for partial shade to shelter young trees that tend to do better with shade. So there are some species of trees that are what we call shade tolerant, which are trees that will actually thrive more in the shade versus in the direct sunlight. And those trees tend to be less valuable in terms of selling their wood, but at the same time, those are trees that are going to thrive more in what we call a shelter wood cut versus a clear cut. Right. So what should you do with your timber stand? Well, again, it might depend on what your goals are and what kind of timber you have on your property. Right. So again, if you go up to the Pacific Northwest, like Oregon or Washington State or Northern California, or again, if you're over there in the East Coast, like my home state of West Virginia or Pennsylvania or places like that, chances are you could acquire a piece of property that has a couple acres attached to it. It's pretty expensive to get property like that here in Riverside, but not so expensive to get that property in other areas of the country. So you could have, again, a house with maybe 5 acres of property. Maybe 3 or 4 of those acres contain woodlands or what is known as a timber stand. And you might be approached by a logger asking you if they can cut down your woods, and of course they're going to pay you to do so. Right, so should you cut it down? Well, and what kind of cut should you tell the logger to do? Well, again, it depends on what kind of forest you own and what your goals are concerning aesthetics, wildlife, and your current and future income. Right. So, for example, you might prefer a clear cut if you have trees that require sunlight to grow. Right. Those trees include trees like aspen, red pine, spruce, oak. These are the trees that are probably going to fetch you a higher price in the marketplace. So if you have those kinds of trees, then a clear cut is going to be better for the long-term health of your woodlands, right? So again, if you have these trees that require sunlight and you do want to preserve the most species of wildlife, all right, as well as keep the future of your forest, as well as the potential future income of having your trees harvested later on, right? If you want to keep all those things up, then you might want to go with the clear cut. Right, so the benefits of clear cutting is that you will get some income now, right? But more importantly, you're going to rejuvenate the forest for future income later, while also again maybe increasing the biodiversity of your woodlands. Now, a cost to clear cutting versus say choosing that high grading or diameter limit select cutting is that it does not maximize your current income. Right, so again, if you wanted to make as much money now, right, then the loggers will actually pay you more if they can practice that high grading versus that clear cutting, where they have to take all the trees out, including those that are less profitable. Right, so a logger might give you, say, a certain amount of money to clear cut, but they'll give you even more money if you let them practice that high grading of only cutting out those best trees, right? But of course, that might result in a lower biodiversity of your species, as well as, again, preventing your forest from growing as much in the future. Now, another cost of clear cutting is it's not as aesthetically pleasing in the short run because you've just cleared all your trees away, and there are some value to people of having those trees on their property, right? So if you really desperately need money now, then you might want to choose that high grading, right? But if not, if you care about the future of that particular forest, right, then you might want to practice that clear cutting if you have these types of trees on your property. Now, if you are about to sell your house, meaning that you don't really care about the future value of that land because you're not going to own it in the future, right, then you might want to think about practice that high grading, because if you practice clear cutting, right, then again, you've created an unsightly property, and that's not going to look as good for the future potential buyers, right? So again, it depends on what your goals are and what you're going to be doing. Now, if you have trees that are more shade tolerant, so example of these would be like white pine, maple, yellow birch, hemlock, or northern and central hardwoods, right? If you have those kinds of trees on your property, then shelter wood cutting might be the best way to go. It's kind of like the best option for trees that do prefer shade, right? So you will get some income now, right? And it's also going to be more aesthetically pleasing in that you are leaving some trees around to again shelter that particular area. And the thing about the shelter wood cutting is it can be managed in waves, right? So you can do kind of like thinnings every now and then rather than a clear cut where you just take all the trees down immediately, right? Now, cost is, again, it's not going to maximize your current income as much as that high grading is. And the species of wood that are going to thrive here under a shelter wood are going to be those that are going to be less profitable, right? So those shade tolerant species are going to fetch you less money in the marketplace than those species that prefer sunlight. And they also tend to be less desirable to wildlife, so you're probably not going to see as much wildlife in your woodlands as you might prefer if you're into that kind of thing. Now, should you practice that diameter limit, select cutting, or high grading, which involves cutting only the most profitable trees, well, the benefits is that's going to maximize your current income or give you the most money now, right? So again, if you desperately need money, that might be the way to go. The cost is that it's going to degrade the long-term health and therefore the future income of your forest, right? So this is you taking the reward now at those potential or future costs later on, right? So with that in mind, this might only be a viable option if you desperately need money, or again, if you're quickly moving out of that property and you want to profit from it before you leave. All right, now if you're still not sure, you can consult a forest manager. A forest manager is basically a consultant who can come to your house, look at your timber stand, ask you about what your goals are, and for a small fee, again, advise you on what the best course of action is, right? So that's something that you could, so that is an industry out there that you can consult to help you make that decision or overcome that lack of information so that you can make a good choice about what to do with your timber stand. Now let's talk a little bit about the forest management profession in case some of you decide that you want to veer that way. If you're somebody who loves spending your time in and around the woods, right, this might be a good profession for you. So again, forest managers plan and direct the planting, growth, harvesting, and protection of forests for wood production. Right, so again, they're going to look at a piece of land with timber on it and kind of decide what might be the best course of action for that piece of land. And again, they could be consulted by loggers. They could be consulted by private individuals who own those pieces of land, right? And the thing about the forest management profession, for those of you who are interested, is that there are a lot of opportunities to get into that job. The chance of getting a job as a forest manager are really high just because there is strong demand for that, particularly in our now more environmentally conscious society, right? And there aren't a whole lot of people out there graduating with forestry degrees, right? So if you do decide that you want to go into this profession, you will be competing with people who do have forestry degrees. And again, there's not a lot of them out there. So it might be a profession where it'd be fairly easy for you to get a job if you're looking for one. Right, the length of training for this particular job once you get out of school is about 3 years, right? And the average pay for a forest manager can be quite good. The average salary is currently about $50,812, which is a little bit more than the average starting salary for a college graduate. And salaries can range from as low as $13,500 for people who are just in training to as high as $112,500 if you're a more experienced professional forest manager. Right, and that's at least within the United States. So again, it can be a pretty lucrative profession for anybody who's interested in it. All right, so that is it for Chapter 7. Please be able to read that fishery graph. Again, be able to identify which points are related to maximizing profits, which points are related to a maximum sustainable yield, and which points are related to long-run equilibrium in that fishery graph. Right, so know the definition for carrying capacity, right? That's the most of fish or any species that an area can sustain. And then maximum sustainable yield, which is the most that you can take out of that area and still have enough to replenish indefinitely into the future. Right, so you can be able to identify those on a graph. Also understand how firms maximize profits in the fishing industry, same way they maximize profits everywhere else, by producing where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Right, remember, as long as those economic profits are positive, right, firms, or in this case, fishing boats, will jump into the industry until those economic profits are down to zero. That's where total revenue is equal to total cost. Again, that doesn't mean that they're not making any money. They're just making as much money there as they could anywhere else. Be able to engage in that cost-benefit analysis of cutting down a tree based on the interest rate versus the growth rate of that tree, right, like the example we did at the beginning of this lecture video. And then know the myths and truths of clear cutting. In other words, know which ones are myths and which ones are and why they're myths, like or what the truths are regarding those myths. And then understand the different types of cuts. So know what a clear cut is, what a shelter wood cut is, and what high grading is, as well as the costs and benefits of each. Now, I'm not going to ask you to know like specific tree species. So I'm not going to ask you to know that oak may work better for clear cutting, whereas like yellow poplar might work better for shelter wood cutting or anything like that. So I'm not going to ask you about individual species of tree, right? But again, just know the general costs and benefits of each type of cut. And then just know whether or not you want to be a forest manager in case that's a profession that interests you. Provide you a little bit of information about it. You can certainly look up more if you prefer, right? I know that a lot of people here have already chosen economics as their degree, right? Although there are a few people here who are not economists or haven't chosen economics as a degree and still might be wide open as to what their future degree might be, right? So if you're interested, forestry is a degree that's out there. Again, if you like being outside in nature in the woods all the time and that's where you want to work, that might be a good job for you. But that is it for Chapter 7, right? So next time we're going to start talking about Chapter 8, which is all about that idea of permaculture or sustainable agriculture that you can actually do in as little as maybe a third to a half an acre of land, which you can even afford here in Riverside. So again, you don't need a whole lot of land for you to start these farming practices. And the reason why it's part of this class is because it's about getting the most out of a small area here. And that's what economics is really all about, right, is getting the greatest benefit at the least possible cost. We're maximizing the use of our resources. So we want to talk about how to do that with regards to growing organic fruits and vegetables in Chapter 8. Right, so until then, just let me know if you have any questions about anything. You can shoot me an email or come visit me in those Zoom office hours, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. All right, so just let me know if you need anything, and take care.